I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 137 of the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Before we begin the meeting, I want to remind all in-person participants to read the best practices guidelines and the cards on the table. These measures are in place to protect the health and safety of all participants. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, and pursuant to Standing Order 1082, and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 18th, 2023, the committee is resuming its study on the regulation of recreational boating on Canada's waterways. All witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Appearing before us today, colleagues, we have, as an individual, Madame Sarah Mercier-Blais, Research Associate, Université de Québec à Montréal. Bienvenue à vous. Et aussi Elliot, qui est dans le coin.
Welcome, as well as Elliot, who's with her.
Miss Amy Martin, Mayor. Miss Mayor, good to have you here with us by video conference. From the Ontario Provincial Police, we have Mr. Sergeant Dave Moffat, Provincial Marine Coordinator by video conference. And from the Port Dover Waterfront Preservation Association, we have Margaret Crichton, Director. Welcome to you as well. We'll begin with our line of questioning. Et pour commencer, je vais passer la parole à vous, Madame Mercier-Blais.
And to begin with, I will recognize you, Ms. Mercier-Blais. You have 5 minutes. Thank you very much. I'm a research associate at Yves Préry's laboratory, and we work principally on carbon in aquatic environments in lakes, but we've also done a good deal of work involving lake physics, temperature patterns, contaminant dissipation, the aqueous dissolution of gases, and the energy of waves at lake surfaces. This is why in 2014, Memphremagog Conservation Link, that has come before this committee, and the Lake Lovering Conservation Association approached us about working on the effects of wake boat waves on Lake Memphremagog and Lake Lovering. So the 300 meters that you've heard so much about since beginning your work is taken from our study. So I'll take a moment to explain where it comes from and what it represents. We carried out a study using a rigorous protocol of wake boat passes at specific speeds, specific distances from the shoreline, and with specific ballasts or weights added to the boats. Let me point out that we did not study any other boats than wake boats. We looked at sediment resuspension and surface energy of waves hitting the shore, but not at bank erosion per se. For both lakes, we conclude that the distance for the energy produced and contained in wakeboat waves to be dissipated and thus have an impact on the shoreline similar to that of natural wind is around 300 meters. This is the distance at which the waves from the passing of a wakeboat are equivalent to natural waves on these lakes when they reach the shore. Lake Lovering and Lake Memphremagog are two very different lakes. Figure 8 of a report that you may have before you shows the dissimilar ways in which turbulence decreases with distance traveled on these two lakes. Yet for both lakes, at 300 meters, the effect is equivalent to that of natural waves. All the lakes of Quebec have a single origin, the retreat of glaciers. Being physically created in the same way, they are all of relatively the same type. After we carried out that study at our laboratory, I took place in a similar project on Lake Tremblant. That time we didn't take measurements with instruments, but we did characterize the banks to determine the levels of risk that various areas on the lake are exposed to. Several characteristics of a shoreline will affect the intensity at which waves will reach it. To begin with, the shoreline slope. If a shoreline is steep, waves impact a single point of it. If they're more gradual, wave energy dissipates over a longer distance. Type of sediment, mud or sand sediment compared to a rock face, not the same effects of the waves. Then there are the riparian strips. Natural vegetation retains shoreline soil and prevents its erosion. Finally, the impact of natural and prevailing winds. Boat waves should be compared to a lake's natural waves. For example, in some bays, there are very few waves. but waves caused by prevailing natural winds will affect the lake more. We also want to include storm winds. A storm brings in more wind, of course, yet a storm doesn't last long compared to many boats over an extended period of time. Our study takes storms into account. When it comes to climate change, if there are more extreme weather events, of course, there will be more wind. But greater storms still don't last as long as the ongoing effect of the continuous presence of wakeboat waves. In conclusion, although the two lakes we studied are very different, we recommend a similar restriction of about 300 meters from their shores to avoid waves of greater intensity than their natural waves. So I believe that this 300 meters that we settled on in our study can be applied to many other lakes, given that the two lakes we studied were different, yet were similarly affected by wakeboat waves. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Mercier-Blais, and thank you for having joined you here with your family.
Yours for your opening remarks. You have 5 minutes, please.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate the invite from MP Lewis to attend today, and I apologize my screen is so dark. The sun is coming down in Ontario, and I'm losing daylight. Good afternoon. My name is Amy Martin. I'm the mayor of Norfolk County, and I'm pleased to be here representing our community, speaking with you today about the importance of marinas and access to waterways. Norfolk County is uniquely positioned 45 minutes southwest of Hamilton along the shores of Lake Erie in Ontario. We are a rural mid-sized single-tier municipality home to 73,000 residents and about 1,600 square kilometers of land mass, and of that, 185 kilometers on the shoreline of Lake Erie. Agriculture, industrial innovation, and tourism are the main drivers of the economy, with a large focus on seasonal tourism to the waterfront. Even though Norfolk County owns very little beachfront property, it is a key to the tourism industry that we leverage the waterfront communities and amenities that we have to build out a viable tourism industry that is based on our natural features. So over 185 kilometers of Lake Erie shoreline in Norfolk County, only 14.2 kilometers are publicly accessible, and of that, 4.7 kilometers owned by the county. We have marinas along that shoreline with more than 13 in the area, 2 of which are publicly owned by Norfolk County and managed by the municipality, and the others are private enterprises. So I'd like to just take a couple moments and chat with you about the publicly owned assets. The Port Rowan Harbor Marina was a federal asset until the former township and then municipality took it over in 1970. It's home to about 40 seasonal docking slips, 2 transient slips, 38 water leases, and it's about 10.89 acres in size. The asset is used as much more than a marina. It's a waterfront park. It's home to countless community events, and it's woven into the fabric of the small harborfront community. 29% of these Port Rowan boaters, of the Port Rowan Marina boaters, are from out of the county, and the marina is currently run as a passive marina with minimal staff resources being spent in there. Slips can range from $793 to $881, but it's worth noting that currently the marina does not turn a profit right now to keep up with the capital requirements at present. Port Dover is the second community I'd like to touch on. It is home to the second municipally owned marina, about 69 acres of property consisting of a breakwater system, service wharf structures, a floating dock, and a launching ramp. And this came to Norfolk County in 2007 through the Federal Recreational Harbor Divestiture Program. The federal government owns lands in close proximity, and the marina is beside a federal commercial fish basin that has a land lease for the federal harbor master. The marina is home to 458 boat slips, 55% of those boaters coming from outside of Norfolk County. And worth noting that 150 of these boats are too large or too deep to go elsewhere, so they need a properly dredged space to accommodate their vessel. 90 boats are sailboats with about 180 sailors in the marina. And it's also home to the Port Dover Sailing School, a not-for-profit, volunteer-driven organization that's been running for 15 years. And it gives opportunities for youth to be comfortable with the lake. It started with 50 kids, and in 2024, the summer program finished with 150. The boat slips in the Port Dover Marina can range from $77 to $91 per square foot. And just for some information for you, Lake Erie, great boating lake, but the average boat in size is about 22 feet, just to be able to manage the waves and the wind. So roughly a 22-foot boat used is selling for about $20,000, and that's a conservative figure. In recent discussions, I've kind of averaged out that sailors spend around $2,000 worth of annual maintenance on a boat. $2,600 to $3,200 can be spent on seasonal dry dockage and storage fees. $3,000 a year can be spent on boat supplies, and much more, if upwards of $10,000 if maintenance might be required. And while all of these estimates are conservative, if we ballpark the average boat owner spending $5,000 a year before operating costs, it's a contribution to the boating economy of $2.6 million just from Norfolk County's 2 publicly owned marinas, let alone far-reaching impacts across Ontario and Canada. All of that to say the numbers can change, but the point is that there's a significant amount of money being spent on the boating marine industry. We also have weekly racing and other regattas that occur through a variety of clubs, including the Port Dover Yacht Club, whose members are not part of the municipally owned asset. But these events can include anywhere from 6 to 50 boats with crews of 4 to upwards, headed out every single week on the lake, with maybe 200 sailors participating. Port Dover is also home to a stopover in the annual Interclub sailing event that started in 1957 when sailors from the U.S. Decided to stop over in Port Dover, among other areas, for a few nights to race and enjoy the community. We can't estimate what those economic spin-offs are, but we do know that this event brings repeat visitors outside of the chartered racing event. And those partner clubs are Buffalo Yacht Club, Erie Yacht Club, and Port Dover. They also make stops to Port Colborne, to Point Albino Summer Station, and the Buffalo Canoe Club. And so those visitors are coming from Ashtabula, Ohio, Erie, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, New York, Dunkirk, New York, and so on. And I also think it's worth noting that a lot of boaters will find safe harbor out and tuck inside Long Point, or stay in the marina and use their boat technically as a floating summer cottage, which creates unknown impacts in the rental market, the short-term rental market, and Airbnb in a tourism community. The boating, community has so many variables, to the size of a gas tank, the price of dockage and storage, but we know that there are significant impacts being made to the economy in a direct economic development way and from a tourism perspective. But one thing that I'd like to touch on is the commercial boating industry.
Fortunately, Ms. Martin, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up. You're already 1 minute and 20 over. Perhaps you can...
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
That's okay. I just want to be fair to all the members.
Wrap it up.
I'm sure you'll have a lot of time to answer those questions or add that into the questions. Maybe I'll give you an extra 15 seconds if you have a salient
I'll wrap
point.
it up. I appreciate that.
Okay.
That's great. Port Dover was at once the largest freshwater fishing fleet, and so there are lots of commercial and industrial impacts to the waterways and the marina and so on. And so, within an hour and a half, you can be within 110 million Americans from an industrial and a commercial market. So happy to answer any questions. Thank you for the extra time.
Thank you very much, Mayor Martin. Next, we'll go to Sergeant Moffat. Sergeant Moffat, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, sir. The floor is yours. Apologies, Sergeant Moffat, you're on mute. I want to make sure that all the members can hear you here.
That would be helpful. Thank you. I thought that turned on your end. But anyway. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Dave Moffat. I'm the Provincial Marine Coordinator for the Ontario Provincial Police. I would like to thank you, the Standing Committee on Transport and Infrastructure and Communities, for this opportunity to speak to you regarding marine safety and security across the country. I've been an OPP member for 29 years, and I've been a Marine Enforcement Officer and Marine Instructor for 24 years. I am one of the executive chairs for the Canadian Enforcement Marine Advisors, which is CEMA, which consists of over 70 Marine Enforcement Officers across the country. In my current role as the Provincial Marine Coordinator, I oversee everything marine within the OPP and communicate with Transport Canada regarding the legislation, ideally to make marine transportation and recreational boating safer in OPP jurisdictional waterways, and through my work with CEMA across the country. I have 5 quick matters that I'd like to address today. Firstly, the OPP have worked diligently to inform Transport Canada regarding the need for mandatory wear of life jackets legislation for vessels 6 meters and under due to Ontario's 87% fatality rate of boaters not wearing life jackets or PFDs. The OPP have authored resolutions passed by the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police and the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police supporting this issue. Mandatory wear of life jacket legislation would decrease the boating fatalities rate across the country. Secondly, the OPP are in conversation with Transport Canada to enhance enforcement officers' authorities on the water. This conversation includes the blue light authority for vessels to stop when signaled by the police, and also suspension of vessel operator licenses. This suspension would occur when an operator has been charged with impaired operation by alcohol or drug, or when an operator registered a warning on an approved screening device when tested for alcohol consumption. Currently, there is no suspension authority for this, and essentially an operator can drive their vessel away after police interaction and subsequently suspension of their Ontario Motor Vehicle Driver's License. My third point, Transport Canada Marine Safety Inspectors, or MSIs, have a large responsibility to inspect commercial vessels across the country. They work with a small number of enforcement organizations to inspect vessels in their areas of responsibility, which equates to a small number of commercial vessel inspections in totality. So enforcement officers are busy day to day to ensure our waterways are safe for everyone using them by education or enforcement of the legislation. And this is why I'm bringing it up today. There needs to be a shared, compatible participation between the recreational and the commercial vessel community to ensure a safe environment on the water. The Contraventions Act allows enforcement officers to charge a violator using a federal act like the Canada Shipping Act 2001 by means of a provincial offense notice, which is essentially a ticket. And the charge stays at a criminal court, which it needs to be, and goes to our provincial court system, which is called a traffic court system. Charges through the Contraventions Act can only be issued for the charges identified in the contraventions regulations. These regulations are heavily favored for the recreational vessel community. It's about 95 to 97% goes to the recreational community and not the small commercial vessel community. Therefore, there is little to no proactive small commercial vessel enforcement done because of the lack of small commercial vessel charges available through the contraventions regulations. To ensure small commercial vessel compliance on our waterways, why not use us, the patrolling officers, enforcement officers that are the eyes and ears of Transport Canada, and not just the MSIs, and have the officers educate and enforce small commercial vessel legislation proactively, especially when the accused is present on the vessel that is stopped. Currently, enforcement officers would have to pass the file onto an MSI for a follow-up investigation, which can be very problematic as the accused has to be located at a later time and sometimes cannot be located. An update to the contraventions regulations to include small commercial vessels is needed. My fourth point, as a provincial marine coordinator, I rely on collision statistics to anticipate what issues that need to be addressed on our waterways provincially. Due to the lack of mandated collision reporting in Canada for recreational vessels, we cannot learn the issues involving these collisions in a timely manner. A report does come out by TC, seldomly, and it's usually very outdated, about 3 to 4 years outdated. I believe that we need to have required recreational collision reporting for vessel collisions to learn about what is happening on our waterways annually. And my last point, which I know you've heard about, is about the flare disposal program that Transport Canada did not fund this year. As you know, vessels are required to carry flares on board their vessels, depending on their vessel size, the size of the waterway, and their proximity to land. Flares expire 4 years after the manufacture date, and when they do expire, boaters have no way of disposing them. Operators resort to disposing the flares improperly by putting them in landfills, setting them off illegally, or leave them in a corner of the garage and basement for years, which could lead to a fire or explosion. The funding does need to be returned so that there's a proper and safe way for Canadian boaters to dispose of the flares. Anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity and time.
Thank you very much, Sergeant Moffat, and the members have been advised that you do need to leave at 5:30, so we're going to respect your time and try and direct our questions to you at the outset. Next and finally, for opening remarks, we'll go to Ms. Crichton. Ms. Crichton, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
To the chair and all committee members, my name is Margaret Creighton, and I'm a director of the Port Dover Waterfront Preservation Association. In April 2007, the federal government transferred ownership of the Port Dover Harbor Marina to Norfolk County as part of the Recreational Harbor Marina Divestiture Program. Through the transfer, the citizens of Norfolk County gained a tremendously valuable asset. Over the years, our association has advocated to keep the marina as a publicly owned and operated facility. This is so that the public may enjoy recreational boating and retain both physical and visual access to the waterfront. Port Dover is a community with a vibrant marine heritage. We have an active commercial fishery along with the Port Dover Harbor Marina. Both of these draw in local and tourist dollars and drive our economy. There are 458 slips in the marina along with 11 transient slips. It provides recreational boaters with public waterfront access to Long Point Bay. In addition, the Port Dover Yacht Club Sailing School, which has occupied the marina for more than 15 years, teaches boating, safety, and sailing schools to students of all ages and abilities. Our association would like to see the marina continue to remain a public asset to protect the public's ability to pursue recreational boating on Long Point Bay. Port Dover is one of 3 safe harbors on the north shore of Lake Erie. The Canadian Coast Guard stationed at the marina plays a major role in search and rescue operations to keep boaters safe. Lake Erie, as the shallowest of the Great Lakes, has a tendency to produce unpredictable conditions that can result in strong winds and waves over 20 feet high. The vital role of the Canadian Coast Guard cannot be overemphasized. Recreational boaters' access to the Port Dover Harbor and marina is critical for safe passage. Over time, when sediment builds up, dredging becomes absolutely necessary. The funding for dredging should continue to be both a municipal and federal responsibility. The following are issues that are relevant to the Port Dover Harbor Marina, as well as the majority of marinas across Canada. PCOC, as was previously mentioned, at the present time, Transport Canada does not require a pleasure craft operator card for those individuals who rent boats or jet skis. Rental businesses provide a temporary boating license to those who do not have a PCOC. Given the high speed that powerboats and jet skis can travel, it would be most prudent if the operators are well aware of safe boating rules on the water. The requirement of a PCOC would help to reduce the potential for tragedies on our waterways. Distress flares, again, as was previously mentioned, but in September, Bill Jerry, commander of Canboat Port Dover, sent a letter to Transport Canada advocating for the reinstatement of the funding under the Boating Safety Contribution Program for the Distress Flare Collection and Disposal Program. This program was previously administered through the Canadian Power and Sail Squadrons, now called Canboat Notice Savoir across Canada. There is no other Canada-wide program, and there are only a few local disposal options left. Many boaters are carrying both the pyrotechnic distress flares required by Transport Canada, as well as older flares that are now expired and potentially dangerous. Some of these toxic flares are ending up in landfills, while others are being lit on land. It is imperative that Transport Canada takes action on this issue. Education. Our local Canboat Port Dover still does courtesy safety equipment checks of vessels by request. A safety day may be held next year, which would include these checks. It would be of great benefit if Transport Canada could produce up-to-date videos on mandated safety equipment and how to handle emergencies on the water. Perhaps Canboat and Transport Canada could work collaboratively on this. Recommendations. Maintain a strong presence at Canadian Coast Guard stations across Canada. Support safety on our waterways by requiring boat and jet ski renters to have a PCOC. Reinstate the funding under the Boating Safety Contribution Program for the Distress Flare Collection and Disposal Program. Work with Canboat to produce safety equipment videos and videos demonstrating how to handle on-water emergencies. Work with municipal and private marinas to ensure that recreational boating and safety on the water are being promoted. And finally, encourage and protect the public's physical and visual access to our waterways while promoting recreational boating. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Crichton. We'll begin our line of questioning today with Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours.
We're going to go over to Mel, I think.
Oh, we are going to go to, okay. We'll go to you, Mr. Arnold. Mr. Arnold, you have the floor. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here. In full disclosure, I spent 26 years in the small boat repair business and 15 years prior to that building boats, so I'm quite familiar with recreational boating, at least in my part of the world, the North Okanagan, Shuswap, and British Columbia. Mr. Moffat, if you could, before you have to leave, can you describe how you coordinate with other departments such as DFO or the Ministry of Natural Resources in patrols on water? In my area, I find that those enforcement agencies often have to pool resources in order to do patrols. Is a similar situation in Ontario?
Firstly, as far as DFO, or Office of Boating Safety, and the MNR, we do all the training for the MNR. We train every single one of their officers to obtain their commercial license. So that is a very strong relationship we have. As far as the patrols go, yes, we do share patrols all over the province. There's the relationships that each detachment has with their local M&R officer is a very strong one. There's some things that the M&R officers do that we don't do, and vice versa. So we want to be a very proactive police force as well as the M&R to really deal with all the issues across the province. So yes, we do have a very strong relationship.
And do each of those departments have sufficient resources for doing their work, or do they find efficiencies or even just the ability to do patrols only because they can pool resources?
So all of our detachment, or water detachments as we call them, do have vessels. They do have marine officers. But do we have enough people out there? I'm going to say absolutely not. We do not. When you look at the size of these water bodies and the number of water bodies each detachment has, so for instance, in the Muskokas, how many water bodies they have and how many people expects to see the police on their lake is huge. And we only have a small marine presence on the big three, Lake Rosso, Joseph, and Muskoka, and of course the 22 or 28 smaller lakes in the area. So we do need more officers. We do need more boats. We need better boats. We need funding for sure. And when we have those difficulties, then we do, rely on our partners to, having joint patrols, because the M&R work alone.
Yep. Thank you. It sounds like a very similar situation to the Shuswap and the Okanagan, where officers have to pool their resources in order to be able to do efficient patrols. Next, I want to switch to Ms. Creighton, if I could. You were suggesting that rental operators are required to possess pleasure craft operators cards. Can you tell me, to your knowledge, how long it takes to study and obtain the PCOC?
I'm not sure exactly how long the online testing takes, because it's been many years since I took that test myself. But the book that Transport Canada put out about safe boating was the resource that I used way back when, and I hope that is still around. That is a really good resource for all boaters, for that matter. But you're asking me directly how long it would take to study and then do the test. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Well, I think that it would be up to the individual. If they had any on-water boating experience, then the test would be a lot easier, I would think. The other issue, I think, is the integrity involved in taking that test. If it is, in fact, the person that's going to be getting the PCOC or someone helping them out while they're doing the
just
test.
interested in the time that it would take. Would you estimate it would be 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours?
I think it would probably be less than an hour. That would be a guess.
Less than an hour to study and...
Oh, no, for the written test.
Oh, for the written test. But how long would it take to prep for that? How long would it take to prep for that?
Well, I think if you read the book from cover to cover, it would take you quite a while, and depends on...
That's my point. And that's why rental operators are required to go through a safety training program with all renters, because rentals are often half an hour to an hour, and that's all a person is willing to or wanting to spend during that time. Hearing from rental operators where I come from, it would basically end their business if they had to have every person that was interested in renting having to have a personal pleasure craft operator's card. So I believe this has been looked at, and the current situation where rental operators must provide training on site on the exact vessel they're going to be operating has been far more effective than a PCOC.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. Next, we'll go to Mr. Yacono. Mr. Yacono, vous avez 6 minutes. À vous la parole.
You have 6 minutes, sir. The floor is yours. Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. Sergeant Moffat, I have a question for you. Could you please explain the role played by the Ontario Police, the OPP, in matters of inspecting respect of regulations on waterways and on lakes?
As I explained, we have Marine officers all over the province, and their role, other than responding for calls for service, which can be vast depending on the detachment you're in, but our role is also proactive patrol, search and rescue issues, education. We do a lot of marina days where we can educate the public on what they need in their vessels. The inspections that we do, the Canada Shipping Act has carriage requirements for every vessel, and the OPP has a very vast inspection program. We're trained very well, I would say, and we do about 30 to 35,000 vessel stops a year to inspect these vessels for their equipment.
Quels sont les, vous en avez nommé tout à l'heure quelques-uns.
You mentioned a few of them a little earlier, but what are the regulations that cause more problems, more difficult in terms of having them respected and applying them?
I think the biggest thing, we have some regulations that are, it's a chart, there's no warnings whatsoever, and life jackets is for one. It's amazing how many people go out there and do not prepare themselves, do not look at what's in their boat before they go out in their vessel. So life jackets for sure. The PCOC, it's the licensing is a big issue. But the one that I'm trying to get by, trying to educate the people of Ontario, is about shared waterways. It's about respecting each other's water and how you have to drive properly. You can't zoom in and out of people, especially these PWCs. We're trying to educate people to be a good mariner, and I find that is the hardest piece, because you can't teach people that.
Est-ce que vous avez des statistiques sur
Do you have any
le nombre?
statistics to share about the numbers of regulations and the types of regulations that are regularly breached or not respected? Any statistics?
So, yes, I do. The statistics that I can give you...
Est-ce que ça sera possible?
Could you perhaps share that with our committee?
Okay, can I share? I can put that on share?
Fournir, je veux dire.
I mean to provide it to us, provide it through the clerk. May I ask, Chair, whether we could ask the witness to provide us with copies of this via the clerk so that we could include this in our final report? And you also work with other agencies to ensure respect of regulations, correct?
Tant qu'il me reste, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Much time do I have? 2.5 minutes. Very well. Sergeant, you favor the feds giving more powers to the provinces. So what would that look like, and how should this be carried out, and how would that take place?
Well, when it comes to marine policing, we as enforcement officers across the country, and with my work with SEMA, we all have the same issues. And it's important that we want to make our waterways as safe as possible. So when we're dealing with recreational vessels, we have many rules, many laws that we can ensure it's taken place, like a careless operation, an unsafe vessel, carriage requirements in the vessels. So we're very good at the recreational world, and we try to do our best. And as I said before, we are very understaffed when it comes to marine policing, and we need more people on the water. We need better equipment. But we also have to have that energy with the commercial vessel side too. And I've been preaching this a lot, that we need more powers on the water to be able to stop vessels. To when we're on the highway, the lights mean that you need to stop, you need to pull over. We have nothing like that on the water. We have no authorities when it comes to the commercial vessels. We have no authorities. Like, one authority I think is mind-blowing is that we can't take someone's pleasure craft license away from if they're charged for impaired operation. So we tell our people that, if someone's going to drive away after giving them a 3-day suspension, then go get them again and give them a 7-day suspension, and then give them a 30-day suspension.
So you're trying to say that when you stop somebody that's impaired driving, there's not much you can do other than giving them somewhat of a suspension?
So impaired operation, we will arrest the person, take them back to the office. But if someone blows a warning, which is 50 milligrams to 99 milligrams of alcohol in 100 milliliters of blood, that means that person gets their Ontario driver's license suspended, but their boat license doesn't get suspended. So essentially, they could drive the next day if they wanted their boat on that waterway, which is totally against what we believe.
Favor that one should affect the other.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Sergeant Moffat, and merci, Monsieur Iacono. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur
Thank you, Mr. Iacono, and now we will hear from Mr. Bartholomew. You have 6 minutes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us here today. Let me begin with Ms. Mercier-Blais. You told us in your opening statement, the presentation you made to us, that you have carried out studies on wake boats, but have you carried out studies on any other type of boat, or was it solely wake boats that you worked on? The study that was commissioned was solely for the effects of wake boats, given that that was the problem identified by the two organizations that approached us. Despite the fact that you yourself haven't carried out any studies of other types of boats besides wake boats, do you have enough scientific background and knowledge to give us any idea of the precautions that should be taken with other types of boats? Other studies have been carried out, of course. Specifically, some colleagues here have studied the Rideau Canal in Ottawa. Of course, studies say that the closer a boat gets to the shore, the more the effect on the shore. That's what a number of studies have found. Of course, they don't all agree on a specific figure because the environments differ and the boats aren't all the same. This really shows that the effect is variable, but yes, this is something that is demonstrated in a number of studies. Another question for you. The study that you carried out about wake boats, I imagine that this was in circumstances where people were looking to come up with a regulation to regulate the situation. So they were looking for facts to base the regulations on, because you're a scientist. From your point of view, then, what would the effect on biodiversity and on the health of our waterways be if no regulations ever were brought in specifically to control wake boats? Well, if the waves affect the bottom of the water or on the banks, they will create resuspension of the sediments. You basically change the nature of the water, visually, the quality of the water, and this has an effect on the shoreline. Once, like one weekend, a summer, that would have no long-term effect. But when it's a repetitive effect, then you really are changing the environment. At this point in the regulation-making process, the idea of environmental effects is sometimes brought up, but it's not really a main factor. So boating safety is the main factor that regulations address. Do you think that we should include environment? Yes, of course, it's something that's quite real these days. We need to adapt to take into account the environment, climate change for one thing, but of course human behavior in general. On a number of places, specific lakes, we have observed the effects on the environment. And so therefore this should be taken into account in regulations. Something else I'd like to touch on with you. Your study showed that 300 meters, for example, for the lakes that you studied, was appropriate. Does that mean, well, basically, to what extent is this something that can be applied to most lakes? That's what you said. I imagine Lac Saint-Jean, for example, isn't quite the same type of lake. But let's take a river. It perhaps wouldn't be exactly the same figure. Well, you've mentioned Lac Saint-Jean. It's not necessarily the size of the lake that counts for regulation. It's really the type of shore and the fact that boats come close to the shore. In Lac Saint-Jean, not as many people come close to the shoreline, but marinas are close to the shore, of course, and the boats come into the shore. So there are areas where more attention should be given to this. If you had different types of regulations, it wouldn't be based on the size of the body of water, but rather the type of shoreline, the types of boats, and figuring out whether wave action has a real effect on those shores or not. It's a case-by-case situation, but that's what you'd need to check for. I understand that the issue isn't necessarily the size of the body of water, it's really the distance between where the boat goes and the shore. Even if you've got a big lake, if you've got a boat coming in close to the shore, there will be an effect. Okay, something else now. At present, to be able to regulate every municipality, every local administration that wants regulation has to make that request specifically for their situation. Do you think it would be more efficient or preferable to have a kind of basic regulation that would apply to all, that would be based on science, so that, you know, all these tiny lakes and municipalities wouldn't need to go to Transport Canada to individually obtain regulations? Yes, well, this is a matter of policy and regulation making, but I would like to ensure that more is protected. We want to be able to use our environment far into the future and have it safeguarded. If the process is simplified or you have a global process, that could make it much easier to do this. I'm not making that decision. Thank you. Mr. Berthelot and Madame Blais.
You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for engaging with the committee on this. I have some questions for Sergeant Moffat, and you spoke at length about some of the public safety aspects of recreational boating, and we've heard that this conversation about recreational boating has split into several different sort of subtopics. One of them is certainly around safety, and another one is around the environmental impact of certain types of recreational boats. Now, in the discussion around policy solutions for the kind of impacts that that we're hearing from the witness that was just speaking, Ms. Mercier-Blais, I'm wondering from an enforcement perspective, if there were a nationwide regulation on wakes within 300 meters of the shore, just around the efficacy of enforcing a regulation like that. As someone who does enforcement, what would you see as being some of the challenges that would have to be overcome?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that when it comes to calls for service, it's a very reactive thing. So we will interview the witness, we'll find out where that boat was, and then to find that exact location, if they're 300 feet or meters from shore, it's going to be difficult.
Right.
As far as the proactive side of things, I think it would be easier. But again, it's about having that distance. So we would need instruments to measure the distance from our vessels to the shore to see if that is broken. I will tell you one thing, is that it is a very popular complaint, is boat waves. It's the courtesy piece. It's the shared waterways piece, as I explained before. So it is a huge issue in Ontario.
Thanks for that. That's helpful. I'm interested as well in your comments about PFD legislation and making PFDs mandatory for boats under 6 meters. We heard from previous witnesses who asserted that the data was inadequate and they wanted a long-term study done by law enforcement to prove out the case for PFDs being mandatory in certain circumstances. Do you feel that the data and both the research and the anecdotal experience is sufficient to create regulations now based on what we know?
So historically, we've been trying to change this regulation since what I remember is back in 2006. This was a big issue. And then it kind of fell by the wayside. What I know is that people are dying on the waterways. And if we look at the stats, the Ontario stats, the fatalities in Ontario account for about a third of the fatalities in Canada. And I can tell you that people are dying because they're falling off vessels or vessels are capsizing. And it's not bigger vessels that are more stable. It's the smaller vessels. And every day that I read a report that has someone that has lost their life because the simple thing about just to wear a life jacket would have saved their life, it just takes a little piece of me every time. So I think it's a very important thing. With technology now out there today, with inflatable life jackets, with all those items we have now, belt life jackets for SUPs. It's crazy not to wear a life jacket. So I'm a huge advocate for mandatory wear. I think it should be. I think I'm a small percentage of the country. I've read a lot of comments on Let's Talk Transportation, and I think if they did my job, people would change their tune.
Turning to the pleasure craft operator card, and my colleague asked you a few questions about this. I'm not super familiar with the process of obtaining one of these certifications. Do you feel that process, as it currently stands, is adequate to set boaters up for success and give them the knowledge that they need to operate safely on the water?
I don't. A lot of my colleagues feel the same way. The PCOC is designed to give them some knowledge on the water, which is fantastic. And I, responding to Mrs. Creighton's comments, the Safe Boating Guide that Transport Canada puts out, I say it's the Bible to safe boating. People should read this. If they read this, they will pass that test. But there's nothing that will replace experience on the water. To have someone sit down online and write a test for an hour after they've studied a bit. Driving a boat is not easy. It's not like we have stoplights and lines and roads, and we constantly have to have our head on a swivel to operate a vessel safely. And so I would love to see a training aspect brought into the PCOC and a little more in depth, because what I'm seeing out there right now is not adequate.
No, it's very interesting. And I know one of the critiques of the current process, and I think Ms. Creighton referenced this, is that, there's nothing to stop participants from skipping reading the manual altogether and simply doing the online test and Googling the answers. So you're advocating for a more rigorous approach to boater operator registration and certification.
Yeah, we have to take training for driving a car. So, I will say this every time: driving a boat is not easy. So we need better items in place to make our waterways safer for sure. For a further point, the COVID has put so many boats on the water, and they've exploded. So we have a huge population on our waterways now, and we need people that are aware of that and trained properly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you once again, Sergeant Moffat. Next, we'll go to Mr. Chambers. Mr. Chambers, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be on a new committee for a little while this afternoon. Sergeant Moffat, first, thank you very much for your service. I know it's difficult to be in that line of work these days, but appreciate what you do for the community. I just want to stick with you a little bit with respect to the issue of flares. Can you just describe, so you mentioned flares will expire 4 years after they're being issued. In your experience, what are you seeing now in terms of how people are able to dispose of them?
Well, as I said before, landfills are huge. Landfills, people think they can just throw them in the garbage and they're disposed of. They have some toxic chemicals in those flares. But what I'm really concerned about is, when you talk about stories and people trying to get rid of these flares, and we are called all the time, and people come to our detachments to drop them off, and we don't have a solution for them, is kind of disheartening for the community members. So, to take these flares, put them in a box in the corner of the garage is dangerous. And we've had flare disposal days. We've had a program with CIL would come in and grab those flares and dispose of them properly. Back in the day, the OPP, the bomb techs used to take them. We don't take that anymore. We don't do that anymore. It's not their mandate. It's not, they've got a lot, there's so many things they need to do. So we have got rid of that program. So there really is nothing out there that the public can go to.
So you would consider it both an environmental issue, but primarily a public safety issue now that people do not have the traditional way of disposing of flares, correct?
100%, yes.
And my understanding is that program actually didn't cost very much money, but that it gave people an ability, a local depot or a local collector would then make sure those flares made its way to a professional disposal service. Is that what you're requesting be reinstated?
Yes, exactly. And that, the number of flares that they have got from the public that are disposed properly are in the thousands at each site. So what we do also need, if that is reinstated, we need more disposal sites across the country, because they seem to be, especially in Ontario, they seem to be more in the southern end of Ontario. So we need access in the northern Ontario as well.
Thank you very much for the testimony on flares. I'll note that, at least in my area, Georgian Bay, Lake Simcoe, Lake Couchiching, the Trent Severn Waterway, probably one of the busiest, and in terms of number of boats on those waterways probably in the entire country. Mm-hmm. My office has been inundated with people, mostly frustrated, but just trying to understand what can they do today with those flares. Do you have any recommendation for what they do today with expired flares?
We really don't, and that's what's so frustrating. People, we're trying to help them out, and we say you can't fire them off. It's illegal in the Canada Shipping Act. You can't throw them overboard. It's environmentally irresponsible. Can you put them in a bucket of water and make them less volatile? You could do that. But we also say, you got to store them away from your property, because you never know what's going to happen. So I wish I had an answer, and I don't, and that's frustrating.
No, that's fair. I share your frustration also as a boater, someone who has expired flares. Right. I just back on the licensing for a moment. When I did my boater's test, I was maybe 13 or 14 years old, you actually had to do it in person under supervision, physically, under supervision of kind of a licensed or predetermined, approved,
Boat smart. Yeah.
exactly, an examiner. Would you recommend at least going back to the in-person requirement? Is that part of your recommendation?
I think if there's a training piece to it as well, then yes, absolutely. And as Ms. Creighton has mentioned, there's the integrity piece. You know, there's a lot of stories out there that people have had other people write their test for them. There's supposed to be a proctor. I don't know what that means. I don't know how that works. But we definitely need a better system.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and I want to keep on time for the chair here.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Mr.
sir.
Chambers. We greatly appreciate that, and I'd now like to invite you to join the committee permanently for being the only one that keeps on time. Thank you, sir. Monsieur Lauzon, à vous la parole, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me first and foremost thank all our witnesses today. I will begin with Sergeant Moffat, because I believe he needs to leave us soon. Let me go back to the mandatory personal flotation devices that you would like to recommend. Let me remind us that the province of Ontario in 1970 made it mandatory to use security belts in cars and safety belts, and thought it would be impossible to impose this, and now, of course, everyone uses them. Do you think that we, as a government, should include a recommendation that it become mandatory for all pleasure craft boaters? Make it a habit.
However, I'm trying to be realistic. I'm looking at our statistics through Ontario and throughout Canada that it is not the big vessels. 87% of our fatalities are, actually 88% are on vessels 6 meters and under. So I'm trying to be realistic. The big vessels, you know, we're talking about sleeping berths. We're talking about inside cuddies. It would make way more sense in the smaller type of vessels, the canoes, kayaks, the small fishing boats, the pontoon boats, etc. So that's where we're going with the OPP.
Merci de l'apporter parce que si on n'est pas.
Thank you for that specification, because, you know, the use of vests, of personal flotation vests on large boats, you know, the size to have bedrooms, not the same thing as a car, of course. But other than this, for small boats, then, as of what size boat should we recommend the mandatory use of a personal flotation device for all individual water sports? And up to what size or power of boat, so that we could have some sort of idea, tool to decide where and when they should be mandatory? Could you give us some recommendations, more specific ones?
There's three options, really. One's about size of vessel. One's about time of the year. Another one is about age. I can dispel the age piece because with our statistics, you know, we've kept 13 years of statistics, and our fatalities that involve children 14 years and under is 2% of our fatalities. So that's not the demographic. Is it because the parents are making these kids wear them? That's one of the big issues in Let's Talk Transportation. People want kids to wear them all the time. But when it comes to the size, this is when we look at those three items, it is about the size. We are doing testing right now about weather, about temperature, and it's not about people falling in a cold water. It's about gasping. It's about entering the water involuntarily and taking that gasp of water. And it doesn't matter what the temperature is. People think it's all about cold water, so they want it. Okay, maybe between November and April we'll do life jackets. We at the OPP think that yes, like Georgian Bay is cold all year round, so we would like to see a less stable vessel where people are losing their lives that we have the stats to show at 6 meters and under, which is about 19 feet and under. Those are the vessel types that are, 87% of those fatalities are people under 6 meters, or 88, excuse me.
Merci. Merci. La prochaine question,
Thank you. And the next question is for Ms. Mercier-Blais, and delightful that you have your child here with us, for us to enjoy today. You mentioned a number of your studies carried out on wake boats, and you have heard about regulation, and you're hearing about regulation today, and there's a process underway in Memphremagog. They have applied for some regulations for their area. I know it can be a long process. It can take a long time to get your permit to, be able to set regulations in for a body of water. But once it's there and there are speeds that must be respected and so on, do you think that the regulation that is being applied will ensure that we don't get these kinds of wakes that affect the banks? Yes, well, these regulations are difficult to apply, and the sergeant mentioned this, 300 meters. Where exactly is that on your body of water? Not so clear. But just having this as a regulation, people will be able to see that it exists, and then it might give them an idea that this is something they need to be aware of. It's part of a process. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Lauzon. Yes, I know. It's always very short, isn't it? And now we will hear from Mr. Berthelot-Duval. You have 2.5 minutes, sir. Very well. So picking up on the prior question, I will ask, and perhaps Mr. Moffat will appreciate this as well, from my experience, to ensure the application of regulation, and it has to be posted somewhere. And to post it, the traditional method, of course, is to put it up in marinas, or also by putting in buoys. Am I right?
Is in the vessel operation restriction regulations under one of the schedules. That is good enough. However, we do talk to the municipalities to say you have to educate your people if you want people to learn the rules and respect the rules on the water. So we do ask that signs are put up, but if it's in black and white writing within the boards, then the regulation can be used, I guess.
OK, mais ça, je trouve ça intéressant. Donc, même
that's interesting. Even though normally you'd need signage, posting the regulations, even if there's no signage, but there's buoys, or you've got buoys and you've got signage, let's say, at the entryways to the water, you could apply the regulation and insist on it being respected, even if there's no signage?
Yeah, so one of the speeding laws in Ontario, it's 30 meters from shore. You have to be 10 kilometers an hour. That's not posted everywhere. That is just what people know. So it's kind of the same thing with the 300 meters. It's something that there has to be a huge education piece through social media, through commercials, etc., to let our boating public know that this law is now in place.
Et puis peut-être encore une question pour vous.
And perhaps yet another question for you. Generally speaking, as of the time when regulations are made, because the police isn't out on the water all the time, of course, sometimes we'd like to see them out there more often, but generally speaking, do people respect regulations even though police officers aren't out there on the water?
That is a very good question. I'm going to say yes. So we have the majority of the boaters that just want to be out of the water, be safe, enjoy it. We do, when we get to those small lakes, seldomly, the first thing that we get is wow, why are you guys here? You're never here, right? And they don't have life jackets. They don't have the carriage requirements. So we are trying to, change that attitude by getting to these small lakes as much as we can. With social media too, if it's okay, social media anyway, it gets out there quickly around the lake, so it doesn't help us much.
Thank you very much, Sergeant Moffat. Next, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, floor is yours. 2.5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'll ask a quick question, and then I'll move the motion that I put on notice, assuming this is my last round. Are we going to have one more round, Mr. Chair?
Yes, actually, we're going to have 2 more rounds.
Oh, we are?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll save it for my next round then. Both Ms. Creighton and Sergeant Moffat mentioned the FLARE program, and this has become, one of the topics that's received a lot of attention in this study. And, at a previous meeting, it was mentioned that perhaps there could be a user pay system whereby, boaters pay a deposit on flares, which creates an incentive for them to dispose of them properly and collect the deposit at the end. I'm wondering if both of you could, offer your thoughts on whether such a program would be effective. Maybe starting with Sergeant Moffat.
Okay. Personally, sir, I actually watched the video on that yesterday, and I thought it's a great idea. It gives people incentive that they're not getting rid of them illegally. But on that note, we have to have ways of, like the marinas, like as John Gullick mentioned, there has to be bunkers for these marinas to put the flares in to store them until CIL can come and pick them up. So I think it's a great idea. But there's a bit of a implemented piece to implement it properly, right?
Thank you. Ms. Creighton.
Yes, I would agree. I think the incentive is excellent. Just as a note, I'm not sure if you're aware, but it was in Bill Jerry's email to Transport Canada that in the past, CIL Explosives paid for 40% of that disposal program. So looking at that and comparing it to an incentive program, I think it would be a good idea.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chair, and hand it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach. There's one more round for you, so you'll be able to move your motion at that time. Next, we will go to Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My first question is for Mayor Martin. During your testimony, you had started to speak about the commercial and industrial impact of the 2 public marinas, specifically Port Rowan and Port Dover, on the community. Can you just elaborate on that and also share with us the historical significance of those 2 marinas?
Sure. Thank you very much, MP Lewis, and through the chair to committee. The boating industry in Port Dover specifically, as I noted, was at one point in time the largest freshwater fishing fleet in all of Canada and still active today. So a lot of jobs and employment factors through the federal commercial fish basin. And then I'd also like to touch base with some of the large fleets. So as an example, Norfolk County, Port Dover, home to McKeel Marine or Lower Lakes Towing, which employs hundreds of local employees, and they move throughout the waterways, moving heavy liquid or aggregates throughout the world, actually. So it all can kind of be tied back to starting off with a small commercial fishing industry, and that has a lot of spin-offs through processing and the delivery of the fish and the product and so on, as well as the cargo element.
Can you just tell us a little bit about what you've heard, if anything, from the residents of Norfolk about the potential privatization of these marinas?
Sure. Yes, it was up for consideration, actually. Although I've only been on Norfolk County Council for 6 years, through my research, this topic of whether or not the municipality continues to own the marinas has come up over about 15 times for rediscussion and debate with the council. As you can understand, it's not a core municipal service the same way that garbage, waste management, snow removal is. So while it's not the norm for a municipality to own these marinas, the community is very, very tied to the retention and the public retention of these assets, and knowing that they'll be there for future years to come.
Okay, thank you for that. My next question is for Ms. Creighton. Thank you for being here today, and I want to just thank you for your passionate advocacy for our community marinas. I'd like you to speak to the importance of the Port Dover Marina in the Norfolk community and why you have been working so hard to keep it going.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis. Through the chair also, back in 2007, when the transfer from the federal government to Norfolk County occurred, it was shortly after that actually was it within a year that Norfolk County was looking at possibly leasing it to a developer with the intention of them owning it down the road. And as I mentioned earlier, Norfolk County and particularly Port Rowan and Port Dover have a very big and long marine history. And so I think that when you see that in the community, and because our community is right on the North Shore of Lake Erie, we see that water every day. And that link to the water is very, very powerful. So the protecting that marina and for the public as an asset to access the marina and the waterfront is extremely important for the members of the community and the Norfolk County at large. And just so you know, even though I think it's just over 50% of the slip owners or the slip renters at the marina are from out of Norfolk County, nothing has ever been mentioned about daily rampage and seasonal rampage. Little people that, not little people physically, but people that use the marina to take down a small fishing boat and launch it in the morning and come back in the evening. Those statistics are not mentioned. And that is one of the few public accesses to the waterfront for those people. So there is a very important link to the community. Thank you.
Just one quick question for you, Mayor Martin. I just want you to speak to whether or not it is viable financially to keep the marinas in the public purse rather than privatizing it. And what are the issues? What are the expenses that are considering why privatization was even put on the table? Just a few minutes you have.
Sure. Thank you. Through the chair. It depends on what the municipality wants to charge, and do we want to make it a for-profit business? So we're up against dredging fees. We're up against seawall. We're up against the replacement of equipment. And so through the neglect of that over the years, Port Dover specifically had about $20 million in capital outstanding assets that are under review now. So we don't want to put that burden on the property tax ratepayers of the community.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Martin, and thank you, Dr. Lewis. Next, we have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and perfect, Leslyn, perfect segue. Thank you for that. On to Mayor Martin. Mayor Martin, I feel for you because as a former mayor of 14 years in the city of Port Colborne, taking on Sugarloaf Marina, right from its pretty well inception all the way up to where it is now, I feel for you in terms of especially the capital costs. It can be quite challenging, which is what I want to get a bit deeper on between you and Sergeant Moffat. So I'm assuming because the OPP are your choice for policing in Norfolk, you're fully aware of the budgeting, the operational side, and the capital side. And I guess my first question is this: it's unfair for me to ask you for the numbers because I'm sure you don't have them in front of you. But I think we can share the opinion that it's quite inflated. So with that, the cost of the marine unit in particular is borne by the property taxpayers, correct?
Indirectly, yes. It's levied through the property tax, yes.
It goes to the property taxpayers, and of course within that police budget is the marine unit, and again that would be then picked up by the property taxpayers. And I know in Niagara, sitting on the Police Services Board for over 12 years, one of the things that always frustrated us was the fact that we took on policing not just from the safety point of view, but also the border point of view, because Lake Erie is also a border. And of course, with that defaulting on a local level, that in itself can be quite expensive with no participation from either the provincial or federal levels of government, all once again being borne on the property taxpayers. So with that, I'm going to shift over to Sergeant Moffat. Sergeant Moffat, do you find it both expensive within the service? Let me just get back for a second. First of all, is there a harmonized, I guess I'll use process, I'll use that word. You are bound under the Police Services Act when it comes to adequacy standards when you're on the road,
Yes,
as well as minimum numbers when you're on the road.
Yes, sir, I believe so.
So my first question is, Are you bound under the adequacy standards and minimum numbers on the water? And then second to that, the cost, quite expensive from the operational and capital side. And then the third is, do you find that there should be more provincial and federal participation with respect to harmonizing, as well as the financing of the services that you're providing on the water? Then therefore alleviating the pressure on the property taxpayers.
So I wish I could answer those questions. We have a whole different part of the building that does all that. But what I can talk about is, yes, we are mandated under the Police Services Act, which is now the Community Safety and Policing Act. We are talking about what does effective policing mean, and can we say that it has to have so many boats and so many? We're not there yet. So I cannot answer those questions for you. I'm not in that realm.
If I can ask Mayor Martin, if you can get me some of that information through the Police Services Board, that would be ideal. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to get this into the testimony, therefore, to the analysts, and then, of course, with that, expected recommendations that can come back to say that, one, there should be harmonized adequacy standards when it comes to on-water policing. Two, that we have to take into consideration not only safety through our policing of the waters, but also that it's also an international border. And who knows what's coming across into your community, Mayor Martin, across that waterway, whether it be guns, whether it be drugs, or any other illegal activity that is heavily weighted on Sergeant Moffat, and I'm sure the thin crew that you have on the waterways versus maybe a heavier crew that's required. And then lastly is the financing, so that it does not fall on the property taxpayer. So I would request, Mayor Martin, if we can get that information, and that way I can add it into the testimony, and therefore the analysts can make it part of the final report.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Badaway. Next, we'll go to Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Lawrence, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, and I apologize. I'm just going to go over some administrative matters at the beginning of my questions here. So we had a number of asks out there, requests, and I would just like a status, if we could, Mr. Chair. So we asked former Transport Minister Pablo Rodriguez to come to committee, and I'm wondering if he's responded to that invitation.
I've just conferred with the clerk. He did respond, but he said he was unavailable.
Thank you. We've also asked the current Minister of Transportation, Minister Anand, to attend to discuss her mandate letter. Has she responded yet to that invitation?
Waiting a response.
And finally, and I know we'll discuss this in committee, so I'm just looking just specifically for the documents, but have we also requested documents respecting the big dock from Transport Canada? Have we received that?
Takes quite some up again, sir.
Okay. And then one last administrative matter. I'm putting this motion on notice. I'm not moving it, to be clear. I'm just putting it on motion, or putting it on notice. And before we discuss it, it will be available in both English and French. That the committee recommended the federal government reinstate the safety, education, and flare disposal program, and report this recommendation to the House.
Much, Mr. Lawrence. Perfect. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. I'll proceed with my questions. My questions will be directed at Mayor Martin. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for being so prepared. And you gave us an excellent sort of overview of the economic impact of the marinas and of boating in your municipality. My question will be along the lines of what would be the impact to your community if the amount of boating or recreational boating and even, I guess, commercial boating as well were to decline 10%, 20%, or 50%?
Thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. In response, it would be significant. I don't have a dollar figure that I can demonstrate the economic development impact, but for 1,000 minimum people in the marina through peak seasons, dining, shopping, and participating in theater and so on in the community, for cultural and significant event-related purposes in the community of Port Rowan. It's quite literally woven into the fabric of how the community operates. So the impact would be significant. And then there's also the employment factor of not only the large fleets, but also the commercial industry. And truly hundreds of people from across Norfolk County and beyond are employed by, 3 major employers.
Thank you very much. There's been considerable testimony, and some of it I might even say was excellent, about the environmental impact of boating on our waterways. But I think that has to be weighed against the potential economic impact, the impact on tourism, the impact on communities such as yours. If in fact regulations were to put in place to make it maybe even considerably more difficult for boaters, or even and more expensive for boaters to utilize their crafts or to conduct tours or otherwise, or even for commercial ships, that would have a negative impact on your community, would it not?
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. And I just want to sort of change subjects as well. And you may not be particularly well versed on this, and that's fine. But have you heard, or have you talked to any of your residents or even your own municipality about the additional costs that have come from increased regulation of our waterways, and then secondly of the carbon tax?
Thank you for the question through you, Mr. Chair. I can't specifically speak to any increased costs outside of just inflationary pressures to operate and certainly gas prices. So outside of that, nothing specific. Carbon tax specifically, again, from the boating perspective, I can't say, but what I can share with you is that by 2030, our municipal operations, if we continue as status quo, will increase to close to $1 million paid in carbon tax for, a smaller rural municipality. So as we're preparing our budget, I know that's not apples to apples, but the municipal budget, we're anticipating significant transfer payments because of the carbon tax on the municipal level, and that is status quo operations. So I can only, surmise that those impacts will be the same for commercial and industrial and recreational boating.
Yeah, so to sort of summarize your testimony, so by 2030, your municipality will be paying $1 million in carbon tax. Is that your evidence?
Our estimation is just under $1 million at status quo, yes.
And so while not, having specifics with respect to the carbon tax, obviously, with respect to some of the boat owners, there has been conversation about the additional costs, and perhaps that has limited individuals. We've heard testimony from others. I won't put words in your mouth, but we've certainly heard testimony from others that has shortened the amount of rides that people take in their boats, and has reduced the amount of boating that has gone on.
Yes, absolutely. Earlier in my testimony, I mentioned a floating cottage, and that's not by accident. A lot of boat owners can't afford to take their boat out on the lake because the costs are prohibitive. So truly is a floating asset in the marina, but a lot of costs on the increase. That being said, it is something also that the municipality will most likely be increasing costs in the marina to cover off our capital assets. So not something everyone can afford.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. Next, we have Monsieur Lauzon. Monsieur Lauzon, la parole est à vous. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Mr. Lauzon, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Much appreciated. Let me continue in the same line of questioning with the Mayor, Amy Martin. In the tax you mentioned, there is an important tax, the tax that goes back to the municipalities, about 9%. do you think the luxury tax should be repealed and that the tax that goes to municipalities that helps them with infrastructure should also be reduced or removed?
You through the chair in response, without looking at the dollars associated with that, I would be making a speculative comment. Wearing my hat as a municipal mayor, I would never suggest that any cost should be repealed to the municipality. It's very difficult to take on more and more services and manage the delivery of those services on the backs of just property taxes. So kind of speculative without knowing dollars and cents.
Comparativement sur la taxe sur le...
But comparing it to the gas tax that's in effect, how much do you receive in your municipality from the gas tax that you can use for infrastructure purposes?
With me, I do know that those the gas tax dollars contributes to our transportation transit in Norfolk County as well as reserve contributions, but I do not have those dollars with me, but I could find that out.
Si vous pouvez nous envoyer
yes,
les...
if you could please just send the figures in to our committee. That would be something to add. Let me now turn to Ms. Creighton. Some witnesses have asked us to make the permit more difficult or more complex to get. Some witnesses even told us today that it's easy to do the exam online, on Google, and now you could even, of course, sit the exam with GDP at your side. Could you give us some recommendations, something that could make the test a little more difficult to succeed in? My daughter right now is passing her driver's license. She's had like a year of driving lessons and 4 points of temporary permit and so on and so forth. It's quite a long process to drive a vehicle on the road. So what's the difference for a boat, and what are your recommendations?
Have spontaneous translation, and it's been c'était beaucoup longtemps que je pouvais parler couramment, et je vous donne mes
I
understand everything, but
No,
what I did understand
important
is
to add the
that
translation. It's very, very important.
Yeah, it's an important question. Ms. Crichton, it's important.
Is it fixed now?
Testing into English. Testing into English.
Can hear us. So what I'm going to do is je vais faire un petit pratique. Ms. Crichton, I'm going to speak in French for a bit. Please confirm whether or not you're getting the translation. Donc, je vous parle en français.
So I'm speaking to you in French just so that you can confirm that you are receiving the translation, the interpretation. Ms. Crichton, are you able to access the interpretation?
No.
Okay, so what I'm thinking it be what you've selected on your screen. I'm going to ask the clerk to work with you really quickly to make sure that you've selected the appropriate translation on your device so that Monsieur Lauzon can ask you that question. So what we'll do is, colleagues, we'll suspend for 1 minute as the clerk sorts out the audiovisual issues with Ms. Crichton. The meeting is suspended.
Hi, Mr. Crichton. Could you hear me?
back to order. Thank you, Ms. Creighton, for your patience, as well as our other witnesses. I think we've sorted everything out. Monsieur Lauzon, on va recommencer le temps. La parole est à vous.
Mr. Lauzon will start the clock again. The time is yours. Hello, Ms. Creighton. I was mentioning earlier that some witnesses speaking to the committee have made recommendations about making the PCOC more complex, more difficult to receive to ensure safety. And some witnesses have told us that it's really easy to sit the test. You don't even have to study for it, that you could sit the test with the book open beside you, that you could use Google, that you could even have Chat GTP. That's my suggestion to help you through the test. So what are your recommendations? Something that we could include in our recommendations. What are the recommendations that you think might help us improve the process to make it more difficult to receive the card? For example, to get a driver's license, you need first a temporary license. You have to have someone who's an experienced driver with you in the car, and you can get demerit points. And you also need to take a course. You need to be trained theoretically and practically, and the whole process takes about 12 months before you can actually manage to get, or 14 months actually, if you start your courses a little early. But anyway, would it be a recommendation of yours to insist on virtual or in-person courses with supervised examinations or anything else?
Question. It's an excellent question, and it's one that I've actually thought about for a long time. I really like what the Sergeant Moffat said. His recommendation is to step up the whole process of writing the PCOC should be in person, and that I think the Transport Canada should continue to publish their safe boating brochure. And ideally, it would be great to have on water experience included in that test. I mean, can you imagine writing a driver's test and not actually getting out on the road and practicing and learning with someone? When you think about the number of fatalities that Sergeant Moffat mentioned, I think that from a moral perspective, not just a safety perspective, we have to take action on this and set the bar higher for boaters that are on the water, because it not only protects the boater, but it protects swimmers in the water and other boaters. I guess that's it for me. Thank you.
Merci. Je veux juste partager une expérience.
Thank you. I'd just like to share an experience of mine. This summer, I was on a water reservoir in the middle, out of the middle of nowhere. The police, water police, the forest police basically came over the water, and they inspected our entire boat, our vessel, our personal flotation devices, and so on and so forth. They were very respectful, and they announced or told me that they had found 6 people who were in breach of the regulations on that day. So the regulations exist. Do you think that having more staff, more enforcement staff, along with the regulation that we already have, would that increase safety sufficiently?
Through the chair, and thank you for your question again. I would say education is absolutely critical, and that's why I mentioned the videos, hopefully some new videos coming from Transport Canada. And I also think that, I don't even know if this has been done, because I was checking online and I didn't see this. Animated videos that could target the younger audience, where they could say to their mom and dad, you know what, Daddy, I think you just passed on the wrong side. Children are very, very, very smart. And to have some kind of animation video, as well as ones for teenagers and adults, would be a good idea.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you. Sergeant Moffat.
I just have a quick question to you. Vous savez, la même question que j'ai posée.
You know, the same question that I just put, we're looking for recommendations, specific recommendations to help improve regulation. Of course, I understand that you're aware that we can't push this too far, insisting on safety belts and so on. But could you provide this committee with a list of recommendations that we could include in our report to help us reach consensus here at the committee level?
Is that a yes or no, or can I explain myself?
10 seconds, I think my colleagues have a big smile.
I see that red card.
You know what? I appreciate a man who follows the rules, Mr. Moffat. Thank you, sir.
Are you going to issue him a ticket?
Yeah, I still thank your wife, okay?
We'll appreciate your response, sir. 15 seconds, please. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. For one, like on the highways, we have a lot of regulations that police can act on. We don't have the same in the water. So there has to be something available on the water that we can use. So, for instance, right-of-ways. The law in the Canada Shipping Act, if there's a breach of right-of-way laws, then it goes to criminal court. We need better ability to move all those charges back into the contraventions regulations so that we can use them as enforcement officers to help people educate and enforce the laws on the water, and we don't have that right now.
Thank you very much, Sergeant Moffat. Merci, Monsieur Lauzon.
Thank you, Mr. Lauzon. And now we will hear from Mr. Barcelona-Duval. You have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me say, picking up on what Mr. Moffat said, that this is really interesting. It's the sort of thing I've said several times, but it always has more of an effect when a witness says it. So thank you. Over to you, Ms. Mercier-Blais. I have a question for you. You published your study, if I'm not mistaken, on wake boats in 2014. So that was about 10 years ago. And I imagine that thereafter, many people have asked you about that study. I mean, if you're here, it's because I myself heard of your work through someone else. So how do people react, or how have they reacted to your study? Well, those who commissioned our study were very glad to see that we had reliable data for them. And very surprising, our study really became popular. It was handed around from one association to another, given that there was very little scientific knowledge available at the time. And there we had, in Quebec, a recent study that provided specific data. People really wanted to use that. And, of course, then they ran up against some limits of the current regulations you're looking at. But people were very happy that we had carried out that work. Interesting, after the study, they started trying to set in limits on their own lakes. Thank you. And based on that, we often hear tell, and witnesses sometimes bring it up themselves, that we lack information. Not enough studies are carried out to really ensure that our regulations hit the mark. Is that your opinion, or do you think something different? Well, of course, in the best of all possible worlds, we would be able to study every single waterway where there's a problem, but it's impossible to run so many studies. But we do have these studies that demonstrate an impact, and then it's a matter of just deciding how to use that information to make regulations. Indeed, a number of studies now prove that wake boats, vessels, have an effect on resuspending sedimentation, on eroding shorelines. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Barcelona-Duval.
Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. 2.5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned before, I'm going to use my time this round to move my motion, which has been put on notice. I'd like to move that, pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, the committee undertake a study regarding community safety and emergency preparedness as they relate to the transport of dangerous goods by rail, with a particular focus on rural communities, that the study include at least 12 hours of testimony, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Discussion of Mr. Lawrence, followed by Mr. Badaway. Mr. Lawrence.
I understand it is the practice of this committee to accept nearly any type of study, and this one seems as reasonable as any. The only amendment that I would like to see, and at this point I won't move it, but I'd like to see is maybe it seems 12 hours might be a bit much. I believe that'd be 6 meetings if my math is correct. I would like to move that down to 4 meetings, as with the time is limited.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Badaway.
Since it's moved by Mr. Backrack and it's supported by Mr. Lawrence, I think, when in Rome, right?
I'll turn it back. Oh, j'ai Monsieur Barcelou-Duval suivi par Mr. Backrack. Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval, to be followed by Mr. Backrack. I take it this is the study that is proposed by the NDP, the kind of rotation that we have, that sort of understanding we have, that party by party we propose something. That's fine with me. And if I understand correctly, 12 hours of testimony is mentioned, but 12 hours, I think, of course, it depends, but if I have 2 witnesses, each for an hour, does that count as 2 hours? That's why I'd like to hear a bit more. What does 12 hours mean?
Comments, floor is yours, sir.
Yes, so to my colleague, Mr. Barcelou-Duval's question, my understanding is that it's total hours of testimony, not person hours. But it's a good point. The length of study, I think we could spend 20 meetings talking about this topic. It's fairly technical. There are a lot of different stakeholders, certainly municipalities and First Nations, and people can speak to the environmental impacts. The fire departments are very involved in emergency response. The 12 hours or 6 meetings was in keeping with the approximate length of the studies that we've been conducting as a committee. And perhaps I can ask the clerk for a bit of a reference point in terms of the length of studies. I don't want to be greedy here in terms of dominating the committee's time. But it is a very important topic, and one that I'd like to see us do a thorough job of.
Thank you very much, Mr. Backrack. If the committee is in agreement, just in respect for the time of our witnesses who have been so generous with us this evening, is it okay if I ask the witnesses to log off and thank them for their time? I see no objection. So, witnesses, I want to thank you very much for contributing to this very important study and for giving us your time so generously. You can now log off for those of us joining, online. Et Monsieur Mercier-Blais, encore une fois, merci pour votre temps. Vous pouvez rester si vous voulez, sinon vous pouvez
Ms.
partir.
Mercier-Blais, thank you so much for your time once again. You're welcome to remain with us, or you're welcome to leave with members of your family here present, including your child.
Following compromise, that we would set it at 4 hours with the ability to, or 4 meetings, I should say. My apologies, Mr. Backrack. 4 meetings with the ability to extend it to 6 if the majority of the committee believes that it's necessary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. I don't see hands up, so I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Backrack.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments. I think 6 has been our standard as a committee, so. The Conservative Party did, I believe, back-to-back studies on 2 meetings for Lake Erie and 4 for airline competition. And we did a Liberal study, 6 meetings on rural airlines. So the 6 meetings was in keeping with that and out of the spirit of fairness that this committee is so well known for.
Okay, so here, all right, Mr. Backrack. You know, you and I are friends, and I feel like I'm being taken advantage of here. But we do have a study coming up, Mr. Backrack, and we'll be following you, and would hope that courtesy might be extended. And okay, so we are good with it as stands.
Okay, oui, Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I will not stand against 6 meetings, but I would like to point out to the committee that the studies that the Bloc has submitted to the committee have never reached 6 meetings, and I would really like to see people as generous with me as they are to other members of the committee. Thank you so much. Mr. Lauzon, you have the last word, sir. Thank you.
Est-ce qu'on peut juste débarrasser de la motion de monsieur?
Oui, je pense que c'est réglé. Là.
Oui, mais officiellement, c'est pas
I think it's settled,
okay.
though. I think. No, but officially we haven't settled Mr. Bachrach's motion.
Mr. Bachrach, seeing none, adopted. Thank you. Donc, à vous la parole, Monsieur Lauzon.
So back to you, Mr. Lauzon. Thank you. In both official languages, a notice of motion regarding a topic we have discussed recently, an important topic, that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the Government of Canada made a commitment to prioritize Indigenous relations and reconciliation, and following the discussions of reports of the Fort Chipewyan Métis Nation and the contaminated Transport Canada dock, the committee invite the following witnesses, and I will name three. A, Transport Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada officials. Second, members of the Athabasca Chipewyan Fort Chipewyan Métis Nation. And C, toxicology experts and the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development. To understand the situation, the committee hold a minimum of 2 meetings and then report its findings to the House. In your email, you will find that I have transmitted the notice of motion. Thank you, Mr. Lauzon.
Not doing a full report because it's only 2 meetings, but doing a letter. Peut-être, Geneviève, est-ce que vous pouvez peut-être parler et expliquer ce qu'on
And perhaps we could hear the difference between the two. I will do so in French. There are a few options. Tabling a report, there's a whole process. We carried a number of studies here, and there's sometimes a time between the time we finish our study and the time a report is produced. There are other approaches often used, being a letter from the chair of the committee speaking for the committee, or what's called a mini report. And this is a report that's published on the committee's website. There are many examples of that. And that's usually about 1 page in length, summarizing what the committee has heard with perhaps 2 or 3 recommendations. And, of course, it has the same weight as a report. And, of course, there can be dissident reports as well, presented by the parties. But it doesn't take as long. We don't need to wait for translation of all the testimony and so forth, and can go up on the website like a week or a couple of weeks after the last meeting on the topic. Thank you so much, Geneviève. Yes, Mr. Lauzon, back to you. Thank you to our analysts. I, myself, would favor moving quickly, so 2 meetings, not 6. And based on those 2 meetings, a letter that would be sent by the chair, and the letter would also be published on our site and available to the public. I would definitely go for the letter. Worst, a mini report, but I think a letter would be even better to be able to move on this quickly. Just to clarify then, this would not prevent or interfere with the normal rotation.
Currently have is concluded, which means that Mr. Bachrach's study will go next, and this will come after that. All right. Questions, comments, colleagues? Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah, so I think Conservatives have been exceedingly accommodating. And so I do come at this with a little bit of frustration in that I could understand us agreeing to taking on the study, but to have an issue of this significance and not to include the ministers would just be an embarrassment, quite frankly. And so we would need at the minimum to include the Minister of Transport and also the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. So this is a significant issue. We're happy to get to it quickly because we realize it's important. We're pushing back, of course, our own study and in order to make this happen, and more than willing to do that because we Conservatives see this as incredibly important and something that we need to get to the bottom of. But I cannot, in good conscience, be anywhere near supporting this, quite frankly. To be there to have ministry officials get there and say, well, this isn't our call, this is your political call, and not have the ministers there. Like, this is just beyond the pale ridiculousness.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Bachrach.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I agree with my colleague, Mr. Lawrence, that this is a really important study. There are a few things I want to say. First of all, there has been some discussion about whether this belongs at Environment Committee or at Transport, and it feels like we're coming around to the idea of Transport being the home for this study, and I'm in agreement with that. There are some other versions of a motion floating around out there, and I think that a version that I'm looking at involves some edits that would make it more specific in terms of witnesses and change the wording slightly. So I'm happy to propose an amendment accordingly. But I wanted to just deal with the matter that Mr. Lawrence brought up, and in reflecting on it, and I think this is going to be a study of the committee, so not a study put forward by any party, but rather one that we take on outside of our usual rotation, and I think that reflects its importance. And given that Mr. Lawrence was so generous in agreeing to the 6 meetings for the study that we proposed, I would be in agreement with moving this 2-meeting study up as soon as possible so that we can deal with it immediately following the study on recreational boating.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Thoughts or comments on that? Questions, commentaires, chers collègues. Monsieur Lauzon, suivi par
Questions
Monsieur
or
Badaway.
comments, Mr. Lauzon, followed by Mr. Badaway. My intention in presenting this notice of motion was to, of course, respect the lineup. I don't want to jump ahead of my colleague who also has a motion. If I understand correctly, we have a motion that's on the table, a Liberal motion, before we would look at this motion. In the list of motions being considered, is there already one that we are considering? You mean for the Liberal Party? I think it's a study on tourism, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, indeed, we already have a notice of motion regarding a study on tourism, which would mean that we'd have to wait for another round before I could present this possible study. And I maintain that the main parties at issue could come in and testify during this short study. But if we bring in toxicology experts and the department that bears responsibility for environment and climate change, I think those are the key players able to answer all our questions. And, of course, then you necessarily have to have members of the Métis Nation that's directly involved. That provides for the main players. So I think that that should suffice. I don't really see why a minister, at least for this specific study, how they could really help us with further data. Thank you, Mr. Lauzon.
So
Mr. Bartholomew.
We have so many hours that we're going to be dealing with this. And what was the agreed upon hours?
2 studies, 4 hours.
4 hours.
Yes, sir.
So 4 hours in total?
Yeah, that's what the motion says.
Okay.
We haven't adopted anything.
And then the
yet.
second part is the amendment by Mr. Lawrence to actually bring out ministers.
Yes.
Okay. So the problem that I have is, and having gone through this before in my former life when it comes to contaminated areas, is that, quite frankly, I don't want to, and I say this with all due respect, I don't want to waste my time with ministers. I would more like to. More technical. I want to have some time with the technical people. Thank you, because having gone through this in the past with my community, whereby we dealt with contaminated soils, we dealt with phytotoxicology reports, reports on human health, risk assessments having to do with habitat, risk assessments having to do with basically the community. How are these contaminants affecting or adding risk to the community within all aspects? So that's my first point. My second point is that once you find that out, you have to then align it with the established parts per million levels. So what's acceptable? And most times when provinces or territories put a ppm level in place, it's really not based on anything because there's no science to back it up. So not until that you put the science in place and the process to establish that science will you then have a better handle on, based on the assessments of risk, what those ppm levels are going to be. The third point then is remediation. Is how are you going to remediate it? And at what level, based on those risk assessments, what ppm level are you going to remediate it to? And then the fourth point is the cost. So, and there's, quite frankly, there's many more points to this. I'm just trying to be quick. But ultimately, the point I'm trying to make is that in 4 hours, trying to get all that done is next to impossible. So if we want to do this right, don't waste your time with ministers. Take the valuable time of the people that actually know and can answer the questions you're going to be asking and give testimony that's pertinent to this very, very serious situation. I would suggest that we concentrate those 4 hours on individuals that are in the business versus just playing politics with two ministers that are going to be here giving us really no value to the discussion that we're going to try to embark on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Badaway. I have Mr. Barceau-Duval, suivi par Mr. Laurence, and then Mr. Bachrach. Is that a legacy hand, or would you like to speak again, sir? Okay. Duval.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
To begin, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. There's something I don't quite understand. At present, everyone is saying that it's an important topic, seems to be saying we need to move quickly on it, and keep it a short study. So I don't quite understand why we wouldn't want to do it quickly, sure, but in the proper order of the studies we now have, putting this in at the end of the others. So then it would be in a year, I imagine. But if it's an important topic, a priority topic, I guess we should just run this study earlier. That's my first comment. My second comment, this is not necessarily a topic that I've looked at in depth yet, and moreover, this is not in Quebec. But from what I hear from my colleagues here around the table, is 2 meetings sufficient, or should we add more meetings to be able to satisfy everyone's requirements for witnesses? Thank you, Mr. Barceau-Duval. I think Mr. Bachrach suggested that he would even withdraw his own study in order to put this one in as a priority item. Thank you, Mr. Barceau-Duval.
First of all, thank you for Mr. Bachrach, and I'm not at all surprised for him seeing the importance of having this study and putting the NDP's interest behind the Indigenous issues, which, like I said, given Mr. Bachrach's character, I'm not surprised at all. And Mr. Badaway, I agree with you that it's incredibly important to get the technical information. But having now been around Parliament for 5 years and sat through numerous testimony from officials, the testimony is often enlightening and critically important. But if you don't have the minister, you get to a point and the officials can only go so far. And so if you do not have the ministers, you never get the full story, because there's always a policy element or something that our civil servants who work very hard, but they have a limited box they have to operate in. And so, if in fact you want to get the full story, you need the minister. I am interested in Mr. Bachrach's amendments as to what his notice of motion would look like. But for Conservatives, the bare minimum would be to have at least 3 ministers, and because this does touch on a number of different files. It's of course Transport Canada, so we need the Minister of Transport. Of course, it's of significant environmental impact, and so we need the Minister of Environment. And then finally, of course, this is primarily an Indigenous issue, and of course, so we need the Minister of Indigenous Affairs here as well. And so that's for Conservatives, that's the baseline. The other part I would point out is that it does say a minimum of 2 studies, and of course we are the master of our own process, and so if in fact we needed to extend it, and if the evidence showed that it merited additional discussion, I can't really think of many things more important than the potential health of Indigenous children who were potentially swimming in a potentially contaminated water, and perhaps knowingly so. At least that's what some of the allegations in the media have come out. And so let's do this right. Let's get the full story. Let's get the ministers, even if just for an hour apiece. We can zip through that pretty quickly and get the full story, and so that we can do our at least small part towards the walk of reconciliation there. So I'm not sure if Mr. Bachrach wants to move his motion, but I'd be very interested in hearing that.
Okay, I have Mr. Bachrach followed by Mr. Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It seems to me if we have two meetings, we have 4 hours of testimony. Usually we have 1 hour panels. So that's 4 panels of witnesses that we have available to us. And in my view, and sorry if I'm overstepping the clerk and analyst's role here, but there are 4 groups of witnesses that I feel are most appropriate. First Nations, first and foremost, ministers, and I agree with Mr. Lawrence that it's vital to have them there because ultimately they're accountable, and because one of the aspects of this that is particularly frustrating to the community is that they repeatedly wrote to the ministers and asked them to address this issue and did not receive adequate responses. So I think that those are very important questions that in our accountability role, this committee should pursue. The third category would be independent experts, and the fourth category would be government officials. And so if we could invite witnesses for those 4 panels, I do think we could do a condensed study in 2 meetings and then write a very strong letter to the government and table it in the House. When it comes to the amendment, the version that I have would read as follows, and I can have my staff provide it to the clerk if the committee wishes.
Sorry to cut you off, Mr. Bachrach. Just for clarification, is this another motion that you've gotten access to, or is this something to do with 2 different versions that were sent out by our committee? Or the clerk and I just want to make sure that we haven't.
This is a proposed amendment, I believe, to Mr. Lauzon's motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. We just wanted to clarify. Go ahead.
Okay, and is that currently on the floor, just for clarity?
It is, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
The motion is, and no other amendments. You're the first to put forward an amendment.
Okay. So the amendment would strike some words after the first phrase, and I'll just read it as amended. That pursuant to Standing Order 1082, and following the news of inaction on the part of the Government of Canada with regard to a contaminated Transport Canada dock located in Fort Chipewyan, Alberta, putting the health and safety of Indigenous communities at risk, the committee invite the following witnesses. And there's a list of witnesses here. I think they reflect the witnesses in those 4 panels that I mentioned. But the witnesses that are mentioned are Mikisew Cree First Nation Chief Billy Joe Tucaro, Fort Chipewyan Métis Nation President Kendrick Cardinal, the Minister of Transport, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. I think that it includes other ministers as well, the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, the Minister of Indigenous Services, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. I do think that given that extensive a list of witnesses, we're not going to have enough time in 2 meetings to address all of that. So I would just move the amendment for the first part of the body text, and then I think the committee can invite witnesses as it sees fit within the frame of that motion.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mr. Bachrach. I'll go to Mr. Lauzon first.
Okay. Let's start from that. C'est pas vraiment clair pour moi.
It's not quite clear to me at this point. I think your idea was good, at least at the outset, that of naming all the ministers. Of course, the transport minister is the one most at issue here. I would be ready to add the Minister of Transport. but public safety and so on and so forth, the others mentioned, I really think that you should send all this in writing to the clerk so that we can analyze it carefully. Because when you read a motion in committee, you read it right through without explanations, of course, while you're reading it, so that people can understand the entirety of the motion. But this has led to a few thoughts for me. Getting it in front of me in writing in both official languages, that counts, makes it easier to analyze, and we'll take what time it is needed to do that. I'd like to ensure as well, Chair, that our interpreters remain available. Let's just check with the clerk. Could you let us know? Yes, Mr. Lauzon. We have resources until 21 minutes past 6 p.m. We have 8 more minutes. All right, so I'm asking to get all this in writing so that we'd be able to speak to that by adapting the motion in a clear way. Thank you, Mr. Lauzon.
Share what you have. Do you have it in soft copy as well? And if so, would you be able to send that to the clerk so that she can circulate that? So we have an idea of what you're proposing to keep from that or add from that onto what Mr. Lauzon had proposed?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I wonder if I could ask just for a 5-minute recess to prepare that and get it to the clerk.
That's fine. I'll suspend for 5 minutes to get that to the clerk, and we'll resume at 6:18. If you could make that as quickly as... you know what? Mr. Backrack, apologies if I can get you back on. It looks like I got a list of people who want to speak to this. You have to get that information to the clerk. I'm just wondering if maybe we can resume this at...
At the next meeting?
At the next meeting, which I think we're supposed to be doing clause by clause. Mr. Badaway?
I just want to make one comment. And you know, this has to be dealt with, okay? And it's, as Mr. Lawrence alluded to, and I'm sure we all share the same sentiment, is not only dealt with, but dealt with in a proper way. Okay? This is an issue that's been lingering on too long, for whatever reason. I don't really care what that reason is. What I more care about is dealing with it now. The past is the past. We're moving into the future. There's a contaminated site here. We have to deal with it. What I'm worried about is we're trying to do a patchwork here. Okay, so if we're going to do this, then do it right. So, you know, what I would suggest Mr. Backrack and Mr. Lauzon do is sit down, put your heads together. Okay, bring this motion forward. Add in the witnesses that everybody wants to add in. Ministers or not, you know, I do have an opinion with the ministers because I don't think it's going to add much value to it. I'm more interested in the technical part. And that's the how to the what. And we know what the what is, but do we? Because attached to that what is the implications of this contamination. You're not going to get to that bottom line until you actually get the science to it, which then goes back to the technical part. So if we're going to do this, is my point, do it right. So let's put our heads together. Let's come back at the next meeting and come up with a motion that essentially is going to deal with the situation versus just doing a patchwork, and we're going to have to keep revisiting it year after year.
Thank you. I think I've got agreement from all members here that we're going to try and get this done offline and then come back with something that we can all agree to because we all agree this is important. Everybody's good with that? Colleagues, thank you for a great day. Have a good rest of the evening, and we'll resume back after the break. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.